The really interesting thing is, I haven't seen any other Rian Johnson movie. I saw the Star Wars one, and then I saw Knives Out.
I'm actually in the same boat. As much as I really want to watch Brick and Looper and Brothers Bloom, it's just for some odd reason. Like, I don't know if they're on streaming services or not, but it's just... They might be. I need to check, because it's like one of those things where I'm like, I need to watch Rian Johnson's other work.
Because so I walked out of this movie and I went, that was amazing. This is an incredible film. Why wasn't the Star Wars one good? And the answer that I ended up coming across eventually was that he got to make this movie however he wanted, and he did the same thing with Star Wars. He made it however he wanted, and nobody wanted that. Nobody wanted him to take his take on Star Wars. They wanted him to make Star Wars what Star Wars already was. Because there were kind of a lot of controversial things that were brought up in Star Wars in terms of what message he was trying to portray to the audience, in terms of the importance of who your family was and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That I think Rian Johnson made more important than the IP. And I think that's where a lot of the backlash came from. And we're not trying to rehash, this movie that came out a couple of years ago now, but walking out of Knives Out, I went, oh my God. Like, he got to tell exactly the story he wanted. He didn't have to worry about any IPs. He got to just make this movie from the ground up. And look what he did.
Yeah.
Like, look how good it was.
It's one of the reasons why I mean, even after Last Jedi, I was still excited by the idea of Rian Johnson making his own Star Wars trilogy. I think what it comes down to with The Last Jedi is, this is actually something I've been thinking about for a while, is that we have a bizarre film criticism nowadays is overly reactionary, where people will have an immediate reaction and response in the theater, and then instead of trying to be like, why do I think this way? Let's analyze this film and like try to discuss. They are so laser focused on that initial impression that anything that deviates from it is either marked as wrong or incorrect, or just like, oh, you're biased, or like and the reason I say that is I felt like I never, with The Last Jedi, I didn't come to an answer on where I stood with it for over a year. And a lot of it was because I was trying to figure out, why didn't I not like this movie when I walked out of the theater? Because I just remember being just like, it was not what I expected. It wasn't what I wanted, but I couldn't sit there and be like, oh, this movie's garbage, as much as a lot of other people would be. And like,
I'm sure that was because it had Star Wars in it.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it was because it had Star Wars in it, but where it gets to, for me, is that we are so used, and J.J. Abrams is, I think, great for these in the theater, this feels awesome moments that don't necessarily feel as awesome when you like think more about it. It doesn't necessarily age as well, and I'm feeling like Last Jedi is aging better in my mind because there's a lot of what Rian Johnson chose to do in that film that, they weren't necessarily what I expected. He deconstructed Star Wars and then rebuilt Star Wars in one film, which is kind of crazy to think about because he wanted to break down the idea of, like, this isn't going to go the way you think. Like, Star Wars isn't always going to be the plucky hero goes in, does this crazy thing, and it's going to work. In fact, when the plucky hero goes and does the crazy thing, he blows up a ship, but at what cost? He was trying to look a little bit deeper into Star Wars, and
I think that's what people didn't like.
And they think that's what people didn't like.
Yeah, Star Wars is shallow in its concept.
Well, it's shallow in its concept, but where Star Wars, I think, has its strength is you can dig deep into it and start to explore like a lot of philosophy and a lot of there's a lot in Star Wars you can draw out of it.
Sure.
That isn't necessarily at the front and center of the films. And I think with Rian Johnson, a lot of those thoughts are a little more front and center because I'd been on forums online where people would, I know, shock, where people would be discussing whether or not the Jedi were good.
Okay.
Like,
sure.
Were they the reason the Republic fell? And lo and behold, we get Luke Skywalker in a movie basically stating that as a thing. And I never would have expected that, which is, I think that's one of the best parts of Last Jedi is there's so much in that movie that only a Star Wars fan that was truly deep into Star Wars would have put into it. But at the same time, it just kind of made everyone, it wasn't like a fun movie in the sense that Rise of Skywalker was fun or Force Awakens was fun.
Sure.
It wanted you to sit and think, and
failure's not fun.
Yeah, failure's not fun.
Around failure.
And that movie centers around failure, but the idea that you can still have hope, that there's still going to be a spark, and we can still keep fighting, is just so many people were caught up in the idea that it didn't feel fun that they decided it was bad, and you cannot like that movie. I could sit here and trash the prequels a lot. I still appreciate a lot of the story behind them, but I can still trash them as filmmaking.
Sure.
I don't feel comfortable trashing Last Jedi as filmmaking. I think in terms of filmmaking, it's the best of the sequel trilogy. I think there's I have some opposition to some aspects of the storytelling in The Last Jedi. But I can't sit there and say, when people go, objectively, Last Jedi is a bad film, I say, if you're objectively looking at Last Jedi, I don't think you can make that argument. I think you can make an argument that I didn't like it while watching it. I think you can make an argument that I don't like it still while watching it. I don't think you can make an argument that objectively it's a bad movie. And I think part of that is the fact that people want this initial immediate reaction and then they don't think about it. And the reason why this actually came up because I went to Matt Martin, who is one of the Lucasfilm Story Group, did a screening series at Alamo Drafthouse last month, where he was doing the cinema behind Star Wars, and he screened films like Casablanca, Hidden Fortress, THX 1138, and I was able to go to Casablanca and THX 1138, and he made a comment at THX 1138 about how he wanted to do more stuff like this, where people from the Star Wars fan base would come together and explore more of what the ideas behind Star Wars, not just Star Wars itself. And I realized, because I was sitting there when THX ended, and I was tired and I wanted to go home, but one of the things I love most about film school is the credits would be rolling, the teacher would go down, they would turn down the volume, and we would start talking about the film and start analyzing the film without sitting there going, this one was bad, this one was good. We were just start being like, well, what is the purpose of this film? You can eventually get to the point of, is it good or is it bad? But if your analysis is coming from the standpoint of if it's good or bad, it's bad, you're going to ignore everything that says that is contrary to that. And I think that's what killed The Last Jedi in the fan base, is that everyone stuck to their guns and they didn't sit there and try to think about it further. Because, and I've said this multiple times on this show, I hated 2001: A Space Odyssey the first time I watched it, but I couldn't stop thinking about that movie for 2 weeks, and that is why it's one of the best science fiction films ever made, is because it made you sit there and think about humanity. And The Last Jedi wanted you to sit down and think about Star Wars, and everyone was upset about that.
And that's what we thought about Knives Out.
I know. We completely just unended.
Sure, sure.
I unended. I amended.
I put the token in. I knew what I was doing. I mentioned Star Wars in front of you. I was the dumbass to do that.